Hall & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome to the final episode of HW Fund's podcast series about anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. HW Funds is the investment funds team of national law firm Hall & Wilcox. My name's Langton Clark, a partner in HW Funds, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's episode. To date, our podcasts have covered know your client requirements, outsourcing those requirements and other obligations under the regime, some common risks and failures in AML CTF programs, and significant reforms due to be enacted in 12 to 18 months' time. And in today's episode, we'll discuss independent reviews of AML CTF programs, a process contemplated by the regime's rules. And I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague Taylor Green, who also presented our episode on Know Your Clients. Welcome, Taylor.
Hi, Langton. Good to be back.
So let's start with the basic question. What are independent reviews?
Sure. Independent reviews are meant to be a quality assurance or an examination, essentially, that your program is operating in practice as it is written. We often get contacted by clients asking us to review their program for legislative compliance, and many take that as their independent review. However, we try to speak to those clients and educate them on the fact that it is more than just ensuring that your program is consistent with the legislation. It is meant to ultimately ensure that what is written in every part of that program is operating in practice every day. So you can look at the legislative adherence of the program, that is one factor, but you might also consider interviewing staff members to make sure that they understand the program without it sitting in front of them. You might conduct KYC refreshes or reviews of a sample of accounts. You might look to your reporting or record keeping examples or anything else that you think is relevant to ensuring your program is appropriately operational. It's obviously also important that the person conducting the review is independent, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit, but they can't be involved with the drafting of the program either.
The AUSTRAC website, AUSTRAC being the regulator of AML CTF, has a lot of information on it. Is there any guidance AUSTRAC gives on how to conduct independent reviews?
They provide a lot of guidance about independent reviews, actually. They provide a list of example things that you can consider when you're looking at whether your program is operationally compliant. How you conduct an independent review is largely driven by your risk tolerance and your exposure of your organization. Your program is ultimately a reflection of the risks of your organization. So how you conduct that review needs to be really dependent on where those risks are most prominent. How you drive the frequency and depth of those reviews is also risk dependent. So AUSTRAC has said that if you're a high risk organization, you should conduct your independent reviews every 2 years. Whether that is practical for you or whether that is reflective of your risks is something that needs to be built into your independent review structure within your program.
Look, that is good to hear. I mean, AUSTRAC have always been true to label that this regime has been principles based, and so it's not one size fits all. So it's good to see that they're regarding high-risk organisations, okay, every 2 years, but clients are going to see this as probably the black hole of compliance. Independent reviews do seem costly, so do you have any recommendations for efficiency, in particular whether you can conduct them over a longer period or not as frequently as every 2 years, just given the risk your business faces?
Yeah, absolutely. An investment in an independent review is more than just a tick box exercise that you have to conduct one according to the regime. It really is a good practice to pick up better practices or efficiencies, and of course, risk management as well. So extrapolating AUSTRAC's reasoning for high-risk organizations, we often talk to our clients and work out a program that they can do it every 5 to 6 years. However, that is really dependent on having a further compliance framework that underpins the regime so that you're ensuring that ongoing compliance and you're maintaining a robust performance between every 5 to 6 year review. So what we've been discussing with clients is almost a 3-tiered approach. So if you consider a 1-3-5 approach for KYC, where you might conduct a review of a client that's high risk every year, a medium risk client every 3 years, and a low risk client every 5 years, We consider extrapolating that to the independent review regime. So every year, an annual internal review is conducted. That might include your board reporting, your breach reporting, AUSTRAC reporting. It would also include a review of your risk assessment and a look to clear any kind of systemic issues that have popped up in the previous year. Often that fits in with your March reporting as well and your general annual compliance, having a chat to your staff, making sure that your documents are up to date, etc. The second tier is approximately every 2 to 3 years. So you might look to have an internal quality assurance program. This would operate essentially as a pseudo-independent review. So rather than having to rely on an independent person to conduct that review, you might select someone in the business, whether it might be the AML compliance officer or another member of a compliance team that's familiar with the program and familiar with the processes to conduct a quality assurance review. Many organizations do this more regularly than every 2 to 3 years. However, if you're obviously cost dependent, it is a very time-consuming process. That person needs to look at the ins and outs of the program across the organization. It does reduce the cost though, because you're not having to rely on externally outsourcing potentially that independent review or finding someone that isn't connected with the drafting of the program. The final layer is obviously the actual independent review, and you would push that out to every 5 to 6 years, being that top to bottom review by an independent person to ensure that the program maintains its quality assurance. The ultimate aim of this structure is to balance costs with your comprehensive compliance regime. We try to have a discussion with a lot of our clients around these costs. It can be quite expensive to get an external independent reviewer to come in and to conduct sampling of KYC, especially if you have a large pool of clients and you want to get a good spread of clients. Reviewing your records, interviewing staff is a timely process. It's a very in-depth process. However, the benefit that you get from running a full comprehensive review is astronomical. You pick up so many things that might otherwise be missed if you just assume everything is going according to the program. Offhand of that is that many of our clients have to rely on simply a legislative review because of cost reasons, which is completely understandable. But hopefully when you build out that program to 1, 3, 5, 6 years, it's more beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, good practical advice, Taylor. You just mentioned your processes can be undertaken internally or externally, depending on where you might be in your review process. But whether it's internal or external, who should conduct an independent review? What expertise or experience should they have?
It's a great question. You can have an independent reviewer that is internal. However, it needs to be someone that is not ordinarily involved with the processes of the program. You essentially want someone that's coming with fresh eyes to review it and to ensure that the processes are reflected accurately. Ultimately, you want someone with experience and appropriate understanding of. In saying that, you can have someone external to do that. So it is common to get either one of the big four or a law firm to conduct that review. People that are commonly familiar with the legislation and the regime, have an expertise in that area, and then have obviously got that client relationship so they understand the inner workings of the organization. The last thing you want is someone to come knocking, doing the review and completely misunderstand what kind of reports you have to make to AUSTRAC, so whether international funds transfer reports are applicable to you or not. We regularly assist our clients with these reviews where we haven't previously been involved with the drafting of the program. And in our experience, we find the best structure considers a few things. One is obviously the legislative compliance of the program, but building into that is also the readability and clarity of the program. So we spoke in previous sessions about having cheat sheet annexures at the back, or making sure that your Part B is clear and reflective for anyone who might be able to pick up the program, making sure that you have the correct hierarchy structure in there and that you know exactly who you need to report to if you find a suspicious matter. The next part of it is sampling of KYC files, and it's really important that those are not cherry picked. You want a random sample. So for example, I've previously been involved with a KYC refresh for approximately 13,000 clients. If you were looking at something like that, you would probably take a sample size of 5 to 10% and run KYC refreshes on those client profiles. You want to make sure that it has a good spread of individuals. You want to make sure it has a good spread of corporates and trusts. You want to try and pick up all of those common failures that you ordinarily see. So what you might do if you were a compliance officer is have a list of common failures that you think could potentially be there. No one ever really wants to think about that, but you want to make sure that you're picking up the common questions or common queries that pop up. When you can engage your independent reviewer, you might give them those questions and make sure that they touch on those reviews when they're looking at your KYC files. The third element is your risk assessments. These need to be thoroughly reviewed and considered. It's not a secondhand tick box exercise. It is difficult for an external reviewer to fully understand the risk that an organization might have. So when this review is happening, there will be a lot of back and forth between the reviewer and the organization to really understand where those risks are apparent and how they're mitigated. Next, you would look for a sample of your record keeping and senior management or board reporting records. For example, you'd look for minutes that establish that the board is aware of any issues or it otherwise establishes a culture of compliance. AUSTRAC and regulators generally are really trying to enforce this culture of compliance. They want it to come from the top down. They want it to be a regular item on the board minutes. They want the board and senior management to really drive their employees, understanding that it's a significant issue and that it's their responsibility to manage financial crime and financial risk. Finally, another thing that we think is really useful when you're conducting an independent review is interviews with key staff. Having that interview with a key staff member, understanding what they think are the issues with the program or the inefficiencies that they see with its practical implementation is really key. It can, depending on the type of organization or the type of staff member you're dealing with, you might get entirely different responses. So building those together so that you can write a better program that is clearer is really important. It also tests them to some extent, and it tests that employee due diligence and training program, because if there is a critical misunderstanding when you're having that conversation with them, where they might say, for example, not know what beneficiaries of a trust they need to KYC, well, that's something that you really want to make clear when you're refreshing the program. So when you're considering who may conduct a review, we recommend you consider that the person may examine or consider any one of those items. Plus, you can also pick and choose if there's other things that you think are important. And then you want to measure that against their expertise. Do they have the expertise in the regime to be able to examine those items consistently and comprehensively?
That's great, Taylor. And thanks very much for joining us today. It was really insightful and practical guidance on this important component of the regime. And thanks everyone for listening today. That wraps up our podcast series on anti-money laundering and counter-terrorism financing. We really hope you enjoyed the episodes presented. As always, please get in touch with us if you have any questions. You can find our details on our website, hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you enjoyed today's episode or any others in the series, then rate, review, or follow our podcast wherever you get your own podcasts. Thank you and goodbye.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.